Welcome back to this next video in which we are discussing chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. Okay, so we're currently in the prerequisite knowledge portion of this video, and we're looking at the structure of the tracheobronchial tree, and it's essential that we understand the structure of the tracheobronchial tree in order for us to understand the pathogenesis of COPD. Right, so we are currently having a look at the structure of bronchi. That's the portion of the tracheobronchial tree that we've got up to. And we've seen that the definition of a bronchus is that it has this structure that I've drawn here. It has these different layers in its wall structure that we've drawn on this picture. It has a ciliated columnar epithelium. Underneath that, the lamina propria of connective tissue. Underneath that, a layer of bronchial smooth muscle cells, and underneath that, the submucosal layer of connective tissue with submucosal glands, and then finally, underneath that, a layer containing cartilage. And we've seen that if we're talking about a bronchus, we'll have separate cartilaginous plates. If we're talking about the trachea, which is a bigger version of a bronchus, it will have one great big horseshoe-shaped layer of cartilage with a gap at the back, which is facing the esophagus. Okay, right, so that is the definition of a bronchus, and we've seen that generally, although this isn't a completely solid rule, generally airways of generation number between 1 and 10 will have this structure and therefore will be bronchi. So I want to stress that the definition of a bronchus is this, not this, okay? It's that it has this wall structure, not that its generation number is between 1 and 10. It just happens that airways of generation number between 1 and 10 generally are bronchi. Right, so let's now go beyond the bronchi. Let's continue on down the tracheobronchial tree to smaller airways and see what do we get to after the bronchi. So as the airways get smaller and smaller, they become simpler, the wall structures become thinner, they don't have all of these layers in their walls anymore, and the next type of airway along will no longer have the cartilage layer, and it will no longer have the submucosal layer. Okay, so the submucosa and the cartilage layer are going, and we're just going to have the smooth muscle cell layer, the lamina propria, and the ciliated columnar epithelial cell layer, and those airways are now called bronchioles. So let's now talk about these. So, next along is the bronchioles. Now, I'm not going to draw out a new separate picture for the bronchioles. I'm just going to again tell you what the difference between the bronchioles and the bronchi is. So we'll just use the picture that we've already got. So imagine this picture, but take away this submucosal layer, take away that submucosal gland, and take away the cartilage layer. So end this picture with this red line here, and there we have a bronchiole, okay? Now generally, airways of generation number between 11 and 16 are bronchioles. They have this wall structure and therefore are called bronchioles. Right, now bronchioles, they still do have a ciliated columnar epithelial cell layer, and on top of the surface of the cilia there is still a layer of mucus, and the mucociliary escalator is still very much so active in the bronchioles. Now, a question therefore arises that you cannot answer with the knowledge that I have given you so far in this video. Where does the mucus come from? Because previously all I've told you about the mucus is that it's produced by the submucosal glands, and indeed it is produced by the submucosal glands. However, there is another way of producing mucus that doesn't require submucosal glands, and that's the way that the bronchioles are going to produce mucus, because they no longer have the submucosal glands. So, the bit that I didn't tell you earlier when we were discussing bronchi is that the submucosal glands are not the only way that the bronchi and the trachea produce mucus. The epithelium itself can directly produce mucus, and this is because the ciliated columnar epithelial cells, they are capable also of producing a serous secretion, which is one of the components of mucus, and secondly, amongst the ciliated columnar epithelial cells of the respiratory epithelium, you will also have goblet cells. So let me now alter my picture here. So I just want to add in a goblet cell on here. So Goblet cells will not have cilia. Unfortunately, every single one of the cells that I have here has cilia, and I can't rub them out anymore. So let's just take this cell here, this one that I'm now outlining in green. Let's get rid of that cilium, and this is going to be now a goblet cell, okay? So this is now going to represent a goblet cell. So this is true in bronchi, not just bronchioles. So I'm making, I'm adding a little bit more into my description of bronchi that I missed out earlier on. So in the epithelium of bronchi, you do have goblet cells dotted around the place, and indeed these normal epithelial cells here with the cilia, they are capable of producing the serous secretion. The goblet cells that are interspaced amongst them, they are capable of producing the mucin, which will turn the serous secretion into mucus. So this is another way that you can produce this mucus on the surface along with the submucosal glands. So there are two ways of producing the mucus. So this now explains how bronchioles, even though they don't have submucosal glands, are still capable of producing mucus because they still most definitely have a respiratory epithelium. So in bronchioles, you don't have the submucosal glands, but the epithelium itself makes the mucus, and therefore you can still have a mucociliary escalator. So that's how bronchioles still have a mucociliary escalator. Okay, right. So that's bronchioles then. So after the bronchi, you have the bronchioles, which are these even smaller airways. The next important concept that I want to introduce you to is the concept of a terminal bronchiole. So the terminal bronchioles are the last airways in the tracheobronchial tree that don't have alveoli coming off them. And that's something that I should add on to my description of bronchioles. Bronchioles do not have alveoli directly coming off them, and bronchi certainly do not have alveoli coming directly off them. Once we have gone beyond bronchioles into what are known as the respiratory bronchioles do have alveoli coming directly off them. Therefore, the last bronchiole along in the tracheobronchial tree that that doesn't have alveoli coming off it is called a terminal bronchiole. So let me make this absolutely clear. Imagine you are a little man walking down the tracheobronchial tree. What you will do is you'll go through the trachea, you'll then go through lots and lots of bronchi, getting gradually smaller and smaller bronchi. None of the bronchi have alveoli directly coming off them. Then you'll go into the bronchioles, where you no longer have the submucosal glands there and you no longer have the cartilaginous there, but still you do not have alveoli coming off. As you get smaller and smaller and smaller, you get finally down to the bronchioles that we call terminal bronchioles, and this is the last airway that you can walk through and not see alveoli coming off the side of that airway. So that is what is meant by a terminal bronchiole. So just to draw a little picture here, this can represent the terminal bronchiole. Once you then get to a split, so here's the split now, the airways coming off here will now have alveoli coming off them. So here's an alveolus, here's another alveolus, like so. Here's an alveolus coming off this one, here's an alveolus coming off this one. So these are alveoli here and here. Right, so this airway here, that's the terminal bronchiole. So generally, terminal bronchioles have generation number 16, although again, that's a nice little model to have in the back of your head. It's not exactly how it will work. You will find terminal bronchioles of generation number 15 or of generation number 17. They're not all necessarily going to have generation number 16, but around generation number 16, that's the generation airway that will be the terminal bronchioles, and after that you'll have airways that do have alveoli coming off them. Okay, right. So, what then is the name of these next airways along after the terminal bronchioles that do now have alveoli coming off them? Well, these are now called respiratory bronchioles. So after the bronchioles, the next airways along are called the respiratory bronchioles, and these now do have alveoli coming off them. So in the picture they've drawn, these are respiratory bronchioles. Now, before I go any further with the discussion of respiratory bronchioles, let me introduce you to another piece of terminology that is used and is therefore useful to be aware of, which is the piece of terminology pulmonary acinus. What do people mean when they talk about a pulmonary acinus? A pulmonary acinus is all of the little section of the lung that is downstream of a single terminal bronchiole. So again, let me make this absolutely crystal clear. If you were a little man standing in a terminal bronchiole, so here's our terminal bronchiole, you can follow all of these different tubes. So you're going to explore all of the alveoli that you can get into from this terminal bronchiole. So you'll go down this tube, you'll find this alveolus, you'll find this alveolus, you'll continue on. This one might divide up, and its progeny might divide again. You know, you go down all the little tubes, you go into all the alveoli, all of that great big section of the lung that you can get to from this terminal bronchiole. And of course you'll do it for this one as well. You'll go down this one, all of its alveoli, all of the airways that come off this one, etc. You go through absolutely all of that section of the lung that corresponds to this single terminal bronchiole. That's called the pulmonary acinus of this terminal bronchiole. So all of the terminal bronchioles will have a pulmonary acinus coming off them. Okay, so the lung can be divided up into loads and loads of pulmonary acinus, or pulmonary acini rather is the plural, that come off all the different terminal bronchioles that the lung has. Right, so that's the concept then of a pulmonary acinus. Right, so now let's go on to the respiratory bronchioles. So we've gone through the bronchioles, we've now got to the respiratory bronchioles. So we want to now talk about what then is the structure of a respiratory bronchiole. So the structure of a respiratory bronchiole is even simpler than the structure of a bronchiole. You're no longer going to have the smooth muscle cell there, and I'll draw a separate picture out now for the structure of a respiratory bronchiole. So you still have the epithelial cell layer, the respiratory epithelium, which I'm drawing here now, but the epithelial cells are no longer going to be ciliated. They're still going to be columnar, but no longer ciliated. So here they are, like so. Again, I'll put on their nuclei. And there's no longer going to be a mucociliary escalator, so there's no mucus anymore in these respiratory bronchioles. We'll discuss the way that you keep the respiratory bronchioles clean in just a moment. That will replace, of course, the mucociliary escalator. So here, these are the columnar epithelial cells lining the lumen of the respiratory bronchiole. And of course, I'll put them sitting on a basement membrane as always. So here in red, this is the basement membrane, like so. Okay, and then surrounding the basement membrane, you'll then have the lamina propria. So the lamina propria will still be there, the lamina propria of connective tissue. Oops, haven't changed colour. Let me just undo that. So here in yellow is the lamina propria of connective tissue around the basement membrane, but there's no smooth muscle cell there anymore. So this is the structure of a respiratory bronchiole. The other, of course, key thing about respiratory bronchioles is that they're now going to have alveoli coming off the side of them, and I'll draw that now. Okay, so this is, of course, a cross-section of a respiratory bronchiole. What I would now like to do is go to this picture over here where we're looking at a respiratory bronchiole longitudinally, and I'd like to just draw this bit here where we've got an alveolus coming off the side of a respiratory bronchiole, but bigger. So let's draw it down here, and I'm going to rotate it round 90 degrees. So here is the alveolus coming off the side here, and then here is the respiratory bronchiole. So let me now draw the epithelial cells. So here are the epithelial cells of the respiratory bronchiole. Here, I'll just divide these up. So these are these columnar epithelial cells that no longer have cilia on their apical surface because the mucociliary escalator is gone, but they're still columnar. And then let's draw the epithelial cells of the alveoli, or the alveolus, because we've only got a single one here. So for alveolar epithelial cells, there are two different types. There are what are called type 1 alveolar epithelial cells, and there are what are called type 2 alveolar epithelial cells. Now, the type 1 alveolar epithelial cells, these cover most of the surface area of the alveoli, and these are very, very flat, they're squamous. And this is so that the diffusion distance for gases is as small as possible, because remember, the function of the alveoli is fundamentally for gas exchange. So underneath the alveolar epithelium, you're going to have a lot of capillaries, pulmonary capillaries, and gas exchange is going to occur between the alveolar space and the pulmonary capillaries. So you want the diffusion distance to be as small as possible, so you need the alveolar epithelium to be as thin as possible, and that's why type 1 pneumocytes make up most of the surface area of alveoli, and their function is just to be as thin as possible. There are also, however, what are called type 2 alveolar epithelial cells, or type 2 pneumocytes, and these are much taller. They have a more cuboidal or even columnar shape. And these epithelial cells are the ones responsible for secreting surfactant, which is important for keeping the alveoli open. So let me just draw some of these on now. So here, this is representing a type 1 pneumocyte, or a type 1 alveolar epithelial cell. Here's another type 1 alveolar epithelial cell. There's another type 1 alveolar epithelial cell. I suppose I should put in a type 2 1. So there's type 2 1. And there is another type 1. Okay, so let me just colour these in. So this one here that I'm colouring in red, that's a type 2 pneumocyte. And all the others, which I'll colour in, let's say, in blue, if you can see that. Here they are. These are the type 1 pneumocytes. Okay, so here is the alveolus coming off the side of the respiratory bronchiole. So let's now just put, to complete the picture up, the basement membrane underneath this. So I'll again do this in red. So here is the basement membrane, and underneath that basement membrane, of course, you'll have connective tissue. You'll have the lamina propria around the respiratory bronchiole, and you'll have connective tissue underneath the alveolus as well, which will have the pulmonary capillaries within it. Okay, so here is an alveolus coming off the side of a respiratory bronchiole then. So, respiratory bronchioles, these are the next level of airway along. So, like with the bronchi and the bronchioles, where I've given you generation number airways that are generally of this type, you can do this for respiratory bronchioles as well. So, airways of generation number between 17 and 19 are generally of the respiratory bronchiole type. Now, you do have airways that are even beyond the respiratory bronchioles, that are even smaller than the respiratory bronchioles. Oh, and I've realised I've missed off a point that I wanted to go back to. So I wanted, before we go on to the next generation airways, let me explain how you keep the respiratory bronchioles clean now. So I told you that the mucociliary escalator has gone. So what mechanism do we now have for keeping the airways, these generation airways, clean then? Well, inside of the alveoli, you have what are called alveolar macrophages, immune cells, resident macrophages that live inside the alveolar spaces. So this cell in white here is an alveolar macrophage. Now, macrophages are an incredibly important cell of the immune system. They are massive, very powerful phagocytes. They are capable of engulfing pathogens and dirt particles and breaking them down. And this is the way that you're going to keep the respiratory bronchioles clean. You have the alveolar macrophages come in the alveoli that come off the respiratory bronchioles, and these things are capable of moving around. They're a motile cell, so they can move around, they can go onto the surface of the respiratory bronchiole, and then they can move into another alveolus that comes off the respiratory bronchiole. So in this picture, it could move from this alveolus into this alveolus, and they move around basically, and they are the mechanism that we now have for keeping these very small airways clean. And I should stress, we have now got down to very, very small airways. Right, so you go through the respiratory bronchioles then, which are still airways in themselves that have alveoli coming off them, and that's the important distinction between these airways and the next airways along. These are still airways you would still describe these as airways that have alveoli coming off them, whereas the next generation airways along are going to be more made by the alveoli, and these are what are called alveolar ducts. So let's go further along. So the next generation of airway, and this is the final generation of airway, are what are called the alveolar ducts. And these, you would no longer describe them as airways with alveoli coming off them. Instead, you'd say that they are built from the alveoli themselves. So let's just extend this picture that I've got here. So here is a respiratory bronchiole. Let's now have it splitting into some more respiratory bronchioles, so like so. So let's say that it obeys the model perfectly. So let's say this terminal bronchiole was generation 16. Let's say this first respiratory bronchiole was generation 17. Now we've got a respiratory bronchiole of generation 18 here, and I better have some alveoli coming off the sides of them here. So here is some alveoli coming off there. And I'll put some alveoli coming off the side of this one. So here's one of generation 18. Then let's have it splitting again, now into airways of generation 19, and now we can go beyond that. We can go into the alveolar ducts. We can go into an airway of generation 20. So off here then, let's have this one splitting, and it's now becoming alveolar ducts. So now the airway itself is actually just built out of alveoli, so it looks more like this. Here are the alveoli. Oops, excuse me. Whilst in fact, I might just rub this out and start again. Okay, so it'll look like this. Here's an alveolus, here's an alveolus, here's an alveolus, here's an alveolus. And on this side, here's an alveolus, here's an alveolus, here's an alveolus, here's an alveolus. So the walls of the alveolar duct are made from the alveoli themselves. So it's not an airway with alveoli coming off the side of them, it's an airway consisting of loads of alveoli. So if I was to draw a more in detail picture of an alveolar duct, then we'll just move it along here, it would look like this. Here would be an alveolus, and here would be another alveolus, and you'd have the alveolar epithelial cells lining this. So let me draw some alveolar epithelial cells. Here's a type 1 pneumocyte, here's a type 2 pneumocyte, that's another type 1 pneumocyte. Here's a type 2 pneumocyte, here's another type 1 pneumocyte, here's a type 1 pneumocyte, a type 1 pneumocyte, I might just put a type 2 pneumocyte to fill the space there. And here is another type 1 pneumocyte. So this is what the wall of an alveolar duct would look like, just alveolus after alveolus after alveolus. So the alveoli make the alveolar duct. And this alveolar duct could then divide and give off 2 more alveolar ducts, so it continues on. And alveolar ducts can be generation 20 to 22 generally. So you can have alveolar ducts of generation 20, 21, so this one can divide to give 2 alveolar ducts of generation 21, and then they can divide to give 2 alveolar ducts of generation 22. And then generally, once you've finally got down to airways of generation 22, that's where it ends, and it will end blindly with another alveolus. So I might even try just to draw this. So let's have this one splitting here and giving rise to 2 alveolar ducts. So let me just rub that out. So here's another alveolar duct. This one is now of generation 21. Let's then have this splitting to give rise to 2 alveolar ducts of generation 22. So this is 22, this is 22. And then after that, finally, it will just blind the end with an alveolus. And then we call that final alveolus then a generation 23 airway. So this one here would be the generation 23 one, the one that's the blind end. Okay, right, so that is where the tracheobronchial tree ends, finally, with this final alveolus at the end of an alveolar duct. So we've now been through then all of the different levels of the tracheobronchial tree, from the trachea, through the bronchi, through the bronchioles, through the respiratory bronchioles, and then finally to the alveolar ducts, and then the blind alveolus that's at the end of the generation 22 alveolar ducts. Okay, so another concept that I'd just like to define before we have a break is the concept of a pulmonary lobule. So this is similar to the concept of a pulmonary acinus. So I remind you what we talked about when we talked about pulmonary acinus. A pulmonary acinus was all of the stuff downstream of a terminal bronchiole. So here's a terminal bronchiole. All of this is part of the pulmonary acinus of this terminal bronchiole. So what then is meant by a pulmonary lobule? A pulmonary lobule is the little section of the lung that is downstream of the terminal respiratory bronchiole. So a final respiratory bronchiole here will give rise to many alveolar ducts, and then those alveolar ducts can branch off, and all of the stuff that's downstream of a terminal respiratory bronchiole, that's referred to as a pulmonary lobule. So a single pulmonary acinus will have a huge number of pulmonary lobules being part of it, because a single pulmonary acinus will have lots of terminal respiratory bronchioles under it, and all of those will have their own pulmonary lobules. Another point that I'd like to just stress before we finish the video is that alveolar macrophages will also be in the alveoli that are in alveolar ducts, as well as just the ones that come off respiratory bronchioles. So alveolar macrophages are in the alveoli, no matter which generation airway they come off. And downstream of the terminal bronchiole, the alveolar macrophages are incredibly important for keeping these last portions of the tracheobronchial tree free of pathogens and free of dirt. Okay, right, so I think we'll have a break there. In the next video, we will now go on to the pathogenesis of COPD.